just gonna let him take it off from here.
All right. So I'm here to talk tonight about progressive web apps, and I will be taking lots of water. So the image up there. Tongue-in-cheek way of saying, "Oh, you can't go online, so we'll give you something fun." And it really shows off that on the web, if you don't have an internet connection, then you're pretty much screwed. And so progressive web apps are an attempt to hopefully address that some way so that we can kill off the dinosaur. So I'm Brian Cardarella. I'm the CEO of Dockyard. We're a design and software engineering consultancy based in Boston. I hope some of you have heard of us for this meetup. We do a lot of Ember work. We write a lot of Ember blog posts, Ember events, and release a lot of Ember open source software. So we like Ember, and if anybody here is looking to do something with Ember, please come and talk to me afterwards. We're always looking. Thank you. So the mobile web. The big question a lot of people have, and some clients of ours and some companies have about mobile web, companies like Facebook, is who cares, right? For many, native has beaten mobile web for quite some time, for multiple reasons. You may have one argue that it's just more performant. The user experience is always better on native. It allows you to have more customization of what you do in the application. You can work offline. You can do push notifications. You can do this, that, and the other thing. But ultimately, the people that should care about mobile web are you, your boss, and the guy handing out money. The reason for that is because native is not as strong as people think. So recently, TechCrunch put out this article, and they really just republished data from Localytics. But they talked about how the adoption rate and the abandonment rate of native mobile applications is actually the abandonment rate is surprisingly very high. Typically, it's about 1/4 of all users are abandoning a mobile application right after one use. Historically, this abandonment rate hasn't fluctuated too much, a little bit back and forth around mid to lower 20% over the past couple of years. But the problem is not the abandonment rate so much, it's that the user acquisition costs have risen to the degree that the report that Localytics published concluded that this is not a sustainable business model. The native application marketplace is not a sustainable business. The dollar amount that we're seeing from 2012 to 2015 is the user acquisition costs have almost doubled, which is very, very significant. To the point that Fred Wilson, who is a partner, actually no, he's a founder of Union Square Ventures, said and this was, I think, at the end of last year. So it's not an easy time to build consumer-facing mobile companies. It is not an easy time to invest in them either. In a blog, in this blog post right here, Mobile App Developers Are Suffering by Alex Austin. Alex identified one of the root causes to be the adoption barrier is just too high for users. He cites the issue of discoverability for applications. Discoverability meaning when you go into the App Store and you want to find an application to you or whatever you want to solve. The issue is that the top 10 list favors those applications very, very heavily, to the degree that the adoption rate, if you are not on the top 10 list, completely drops off the board. So cracking the top 10 list is almost nearly impossible unless you have a lot of money that you're throwing in your application for marketing. to the point that most native application developers nowadays are spending more money on marketing their application than they are in the actual engineering of it. If you can't crack that top 10 list for a startup, you might as well not even. But there is another way that we can build on mobile. The web has some really nice features to it that native just does not have. And I will defer comments on Google AMP for now. But linked documents so that we can actually share URLs between my application and your application. It has billions and billions of built-in users. It has a very nice and meritocracy based discoverability engine. And it's completely distributed worldwide. No one company runs the system. So does this sound like something you might be interested in? However, we have to admit as web engineers that the user experience on mobile sucks. Because no home screen apps, no offline mode support, it's slow, and this is known as the triple face bomb. These are just absolutely, despite all of the other reasons why we would want to use mobile web, for the average user, they don't care. If they don't have these other features, they just opt out. But if we could have them, it would be really nice. So you may have heard about progressive web apps. They are starting to become a term that is being pushed very heavily by the Google Chrome team. And other browser vendor are also getting behind. But what's that? Apple. So some of the traits of what a progressive web app is, and some of the requirements for being classified as a progressive web app, is instant loading. Your application will load nearly instantly and reliably on repeat visits. This is accomplished through caching the assets. So the first visit will probably be the load time will be about what you're having right now. But on additional visits, we assume that some of the assets are already cached and being served up from that cache rather than going out. And of course, serving from caching is always faster than serving from that. There's fast, smooth animation, scrolling, and navigation. This is getting better as equipment gets faster, but we're getting better at actually making use of the mobile browser so that we're not slowing down. Offline mode and Li-Fi mode. Li-Fi is a term that I stole from Alex Russell. Phone is lying to you. Install banners allow your app to be accessed like any other native application. Google Chrome on Android will do this right now. If you visit an application that it deems as being qualified for progressive web apps, if you visit the same mobile app several times, Google Chrome will say, hey, you are a frequent visitor here. A little banner will pop up, say, would you like to add this to home screen? And you can install it and it will add to home screen. Boot up just like any other. Security is a top concern as well. So in order to be qualified as a progressive web app, your application's not local host though. So if you're developing locally, push notifications. So push notifications are coming, and these are going to be, they will be indistinguishable from the native application push. They'll make use of, through the browser, notification system. They will work even if the browser is closed. So if you are subscribed, push notifications, your application, your server can continue to push them, and then that will bring you back. Clicks on it, or whatever behavior you decide. And finally, responsive. This is a huge win for mobile web over native. Of course, one of the drawbacks of native is that you're going to have to build several different. But again, who cares? If native is already working and it's already has many of these features, it's smooth, it's fast, it works offline, etc. Why do we care about trying to bring in this new huge mountain of it? Let's look at some case studies here. In 2015, Flipkart, India's largest e-commerce site, adopted an app-only strategy, a native app-only strategy, and temporarily shut down their mobile website. The company found it harder and harder to provide a user experience that was as fast and engaging as that mobile app. But then Flipkart decided to rethink their development approach. They were drawn back to the mobile web by the introduction of features that made the mobile web run instantly, work offline, and specifically service workers. So here's the results of Flipkart's effort. Users' time on site with Flipkart Lite versus previous mobile experience increased from 70 seconds to 3. And this is huge if you're running an e-commerce. The longer each additional second someone spends on your e-commerce site, the likelihood of them purchasing something, that's a 3x improvement. 40% higher re-engagement rate, so users are coming back more often. 70% greater conversion rate if they're using it. And 3 times lower data usage. And that's very important. Flipkart is based in India, and they don't have as good cell connections over there as we do. I would argue that we don't. But definitely in other countries, reducing the amount of data that is sent back and forth can dramatically increase the user experience. A non-progressive web app example is gov.uk. So this just like in the past week, a lot of articles were written. The guy that they were quoting in the articles is Ben Terrett. He's the former head of design at GDS. GDS is the Government Design Services. He said that they banned all native apps. And the reason for that was the cost of building and maintaining. He says, I quote, very expensive to produce, and they're very, very expensive to maintain because you have to keep updating them when there are software changes. And that's a very good point. On the web, we don't break backwards compatibility. We can still view websites. We can still view the original W3C site. We can still view Space Jam. I know that he likes to show off the Space Jam website as an example of the web's persistent. And as much as people tend to gripe about that, saying that we can never really improve the web because it has to be complete, always has to be additive. You can never take things away. Aren't being used or not good. The benefit there is that you don't have to, if your website works today, it will work 5 years from now, 10 years, as long as you're using spec compliant. Whereas on native, every year we get a new operating system update, and this may or may not break compatibility for your application. So you may have to go ahead and spend time on updating that application for the next version. And that's can be costly for services like the GDS, where they had hundreds of applications. And the other thing to consider is that when we talk about native applications, we're not always limiting ourselves to the App Store. There are internal app stores that many large organizations are using. And these applications always have to be updated as well because they may not have much control over what their employees' operating system version is. The one thing that's nice sometimes on iOS is that Apple has been very good about pushing to update their operating. When the new version of iOS drops, usually within a week or so, we see very high adoption rates. But this can, of course, have a drag on engineering teams. So to that point, taking this approach. focusing on web over. The last example, Conga, launched in 2012. It's a leading e-commerce website in Nigeria. And their move over to progressive web apps. So they compared against their native app. So they did two comparisons. They compared the progressive web app to their native app, and they also had a mobile website, a non-progressive one. And they compared the progressive website and the. So comparison to native, 92% less data for initial load, and this makes a lot of sense when you consider the size of installation sizes for native applications. If you go on the App Store, like I actually just today updated a whole bunch of apps on my phone, and I updated my Google Drive app, and that application was 127 megabytes. Can you imagine if somebody put out a web application that had 127 megabytes of assets? I mean, nobody would use it ever. And so native has this unfair advantage that the user experience allows you to opt into this one-time like high cost of installation, and you can go off and do other things while it's installing. And then once you have it installed on your phone, you're good to go. Whereas on the web, most times if you come back, you're going to have to re-download all the assets again. So people complain on the web about having 500 kilobytes asset file sizes, or people complain about Ember because it's a fat operating system, and the compressed version is like 100. It's night and day. It's ridiculous that native gets away with this ability to have like these really high asset sizes, and the web doesn't get to play that way. However, progressive web apps are going to address that because now we deal with a one-time installation cost, as we'll see later on, and now we can just cache those assets, and so you don't have to. 82% less data to complete the first transaction. And this is also very important. If it means that your first transaction is happening faster, you're likely to have more transactions. Commerce site that is. Versus their old mobile site, 63% less data for initial load, and 84% less data to complete. And there are many more case studies. If you go to developers.google.com/web, they have a whole bunch of them on there. So if you're interested in progressive web apps and your boss is dubious, or whoever the stakeholder is, I don't know yet, you can go on here and probably find maybe even a company that is comparable to yours and say, look, here's a competitor of ours, and this is what they did, and this is the benefit. But that's very nice that a lot of these companies are having faster load times and stuff. But what we actually care about ultimately for building products is, can this make us more money? We're seeing higher, more and more traffic on mobile web versus native. So being able to utilize that is right. And to the point of e-commerce mobile websites. So if we look at the columns on the left, this is user time spent on mobile for most devices and for just general applications. But when we consider, in blue is mobile web, gray is across the board for general application usage, native has a significant chunk of time compared to. However, if we go over to the right and we consider applications that are actually getting people to spend money, the mobile web currently, without progressive web apps, is taking up a significant more in terms of people spending time using them. So only 6% of the native application market is actually being used in purchases online, which is very significant. So if you work at a company that is an e-commerce website and you feel your company is trying to push out a native application, you should probably reconsider that and look at some of this data to show that people prefer to make purchases on the web versus. Okay, so progressive web apps are great. There are potential here, but how do we go ahead and. So there is a new API available in some browsers called Service Worker. And the Service Worker acts as a middleman, making requests through your browser and those requests hitting a remote server. So when the Service Worker is installed, then you can capture these requests and do anything you want with them. Here's a typical life cycle of we can install it, and after it's activated, it sits idle, and then it goes into this this mode where it is acting off of fetch events, and we can do something with the event that we've captured, and then it goes back into an idle state. To register it, you probably want to polyfill, or not polyfill. You want to progressively enhance the Service Worker right now because someone may visit your site where Service Worker a WebKit. So we just check to see if Service Worker exists on Navigator, and if it does, we can call register, and then we give it a path to a file. A lot of people are just using this sw.js path. You can use whatever you want, but make sure that you have it work off the root path. You don't want to have it in a subdirectory. The reason for that is if you have it work off a subdirectory, then the Service Worker will only capture requests that are hitting that subdirectory path. So if you have it in like /assets, then only requests to /assets will be caught by the Service Worker. Now inside the Service Worker file, the rest of the code we would assume would live in the .js file. So this event listener here, we are listening on the install event, and when this kicks off, we can then decide, okay, what we're going to do during what would be considered the installation phase of the Service Worker. And here is a contrite example of what we may take the event and then wait on it until it's available. The caches object, which allows us to open up a new cache within the Service Worker. Pretty much everything within the Service Worker API and all of its supporting new API like caches and fetch and such return promises. So we see here that after we open a given named cache, we then get a promise, and we pass the callback to it. Now we're going to iterate through all of the. Actually, no, we don't iterate through it. The add all function on the cache will allow us to designate a list or array of paths that we want to cache. So this happens during installation, and now all these whatever files exist on this path, on these paths rather, are now cached and available for use on repeat visits. So the cache API. This is the API of the cache storage, which then allows you to instantiate a single cache. But typically, you're probably going to have a caches object already. But if you want to instantiate a new set of caches, you'd call cache storage.open. And this is going to return a promise that you can then all the caches within the. For whatever reason you want to delete it, you can just delete it right there. And then the other functions are just kind of finding, matching caches, seeing all the cache names, and then seeing if operations see if it exists. Now on the instance of the cache, there's several functions here that we care about, specifically match, add, and possibly delete to bust certain cache versions. So it's going to take either a request object or a path, and then store the result of that. And then when later on, it will pull it out, make additional requests on that path, and serve it up. So the other new JavaScript API, actually I don't know if it's built for service workers, but service workers are specifically using it, is fetch. And fetch is meant as a replacement for XML HTTP requests. It's not going away. It's a public API, so they won't get rid of it. However, the problem with XML HTTP requests is that it doesn't, and its API is a little wonky. I mean, it's probably close, And most time you're interacting with it is likely through another. If you've ever had to hard code requests, nice API. And this is a extremely basic complex. But the same task, same request using fetch would just simply be this. Of course, most times you're probably going to do something complex with fetch. So you have the ability to set up your own headers, set up initialization options, and then you want to create a new request object that setting up all those. And then off of the fetch, you then pass in the promise and deal with the response within the promise. So to capture requests within the service worker, we're going to add an event listener to the fetch event. And then inside the fetch event callback, we just emit the event. And this one is a simple pass through. Any fetch events that are happening, we're just going to pass everything through and have it fetch. But we may not want to capture, really intercept non-get requests. Right? So if we're making a post request, a put request, we don't want to cache those responses or destructive or creation events on the back end. So here is a fairly common get around that. You just have a conditional guard here that detects what the method get out of it by hitting return. Otherwise, the conditional fails, and now we have a place that we can handle requests. So the next few slides are going to implement a very simple offline. So we see here that similar to the previous slide, but now we have an event handler below that, and we're saying we're going to respond with. We're going to respond with whatever matches comes from within the cache. And off of that, if we find a match, we're then going to hit the promise and delegate out to this query cache function. So I should also say that I think that the caches.match function will always return a result. It fails unless there's some sort of error in like within the browser. Because what will happen is that if it matches, it'll return the result. If it doesn't match, and then it'll actually create the key and I think return an empty set. So I think it always returns something, or it will return nil or something like that. But it will never not resolve, or it's not expected to not. The query cache function, we are making the network request, and then based upon that, we can delegate off to if it's successful or unsuccessful. If it's unsuccessful, we're going to call this unable to resolve function and this simply just returns status of 503. If it resolves, then we hit this fetched from network function. So this will go out and actually take the response and then cache the response so that we can serve it up next time. And finally, we're just either the cached or the network response. So, I don't think I very well, but so anyway, the network response here, if it's unable to resolve, I'm pretty sure that the result of a falsy value, so cached, will be preferred if it's unable to resolve. So that's great. It only took about 3 slides of pretty large pixel size to implement an offline service worker. So this is something that you can add to your applications today. You can add this to your existing website. You can add to your Ember applications. The nice thing is that even though there are browsers out there that don't support it, you will get the benefit of the service worker on the browsers that do support it. So for about 50% of the mobile market, this will have a significant user experience improvement. I would recommend probably going through your application, deciding what you want your offline strategy to be. This is a very dumbed down version of it. Probably best the strategy here probably best for a content-driven site rather than an application. So you can handle that caching strategy any way that you want. You can force caching. You can perhaps always make a network request. If it fails, fall back to cache or pick and choose. For example, one interesting trick here is that you could take a page of images and you can actually, in a data URL, have a default image. And in the event of the network being slow to load, you can actually serve up the data URL, and then when the network promise resolves, replace it with the actual image. So rather than using a jQuery library or something like that, do image replacement and having default images, you can just rely upon service workers to do for you in some much more elegant. So when can you use this? There's a website. The URL, I did not put it in here, but Jake Archibald, who is on the slash service worker ready. But it's keeping track of not just service workers, but all the other APIs that that progressive web apps will likely want to use, and seeing what the progress on the. So I don't have the page open, but if you were to go to it, you'd see like progress on debugging service workers. I think Opera is the only browser right now that has service worker in its production version. I think Chrome has it, maybe. But the real kind of issue here is that Safari is the only one itself. Now, the reason for this, Apple is not coming out and saying what the reason believes the reason for this is because Apple makes a significant amount of revenue off of its app store, and service workers and progressive web apps are a pretty clear shot to try to introduce competing technology to native applications. And that's no one is even like that's not the case. Everyone's coming out and saying you want the web to beat me. So it'd be probably difficult for Apple to support the efforts to introduce new technology that would lose them potentially millions and millions and millions of dollars. Now, we may be wrong. There may be another reason why Apple is slow to adopt this, because right now it says it's in their 5-year plan, which at this point, if they take 5 years to introduce service workers, I mean, that's a bad thing. The other thing is that Safari has had a history of taking its time on adopting, and they've done this kind of slow adoption approach, whereas the Google Chrome team has been just throw every feature into the browser. The benefits of Safari's approach, WebKit's approach rather, is that they've been able to assess how these features fit into the performance of the JavaScript runtime. So if you've ever run, like if you run your Ember test suite and run it in Safari, you should notice a significant performance running in Safari over. And that's because the Chrome team is just throwing features in. They're not really considering the performance impact, and WebKit's slower to adopt. So we're hoping that this is just, they're not jumping the gun. They're trying to consider what type of, but it's highly likely that this is a business. So I would highly suggest, install service workers on your website, get them using, and then talk about how it's so much better on Android. It's so much better on Chrome than it is on iOS, than it is in Safari. But we will see. We will see what happens there. So finally, I wouldn't be so bold as to say that Web 3.0 is ever going to be a thing, or that's not cliche in any way. Of course, is, and I think And this was a watershed moment for the web, in that there was a definitive change in the way that web applications were built and the way people were using web applications. Now, if progressive web apps can deliver on its promises, I believe that we're also that we're talking about that type of that type of wave, that type of change happening on the web for mobile. So I don't think it will ever be classified as Web 3.0, but it could have as big of an impact as the one. So in conclusion, progressive web apps allow you to compete with native, which is great. And that's great for us at Dockyard. I'm sure other consultancies feel the same pain we do. We lose a lot of contracts to native shops. Clients come to us, they say, we want to work with you guys, we like the work that you guys do. Can you build us a website and an iOS app? And we say, sorry, we don't do native. And then they say, well, we want to work with a single vendor. And so we end up losing those contracts. And it sucks. We try to convince them the benefits of web, but I think that this just has to become kind of a thing that non-tech people that the web has major financial benefits, but also it's a wave that's happening. People tend to, especially entrepreneurs, tend to chase trends in tech. Hopefully, progressive web apps become a trend, and then this will be very good for Dockyard and for other consultants as well as for everyone that's using. Progressive web apps will make you money, and they will save you money. They're very easy to get started. They're very, very powerful, and hopefully they can save the mobile web. That's it. That's my presentation. I'm from Dockyard, and if anybody wants to chat, I'm happy to do so. Be here for a while. And finally, we are coming to San Diego. So I'm here. I was here this week. So we are opening up a San Diego branch of Dockyard. I'm happy to chat with people. So thank you.
Josh,
Sure.
code. And you can talk a little bit about